Layer by layer, the Earth keeps its secrets. Each stratum of rock is a page from a forgotten history, a world that once was the surface. Here, forests whispered to the wind. Here, rivers carved their paths. Here, creatures for whom this world was the only home they would ever know, lived and died. Their fossilized remains are the words on these pages, and the deeper we read, the more ancient the story becomes. Sometimes the narrative changes with brutal abruptness. Entire dynasties of life vanish between one layer and the next, replaced by the scars of global catastrophe. At the boundary of the Permian and Triassic periods, the pages tell of the greatest mass extinction in the planet's history. Some 250 million years ago, the world was plunged into a planetary cataclysm. Across the territory of modern Siberia, the crust of the Earth ruptured. For millennia, fissures tore open, bleeding molten rock across an area the size of a continent. Colossal volumes of carbon dioxide, sulfurous compounds, and ash choked the atmosphere. The very chemistry of the sky and sea was rewritten. Temperatures soared. The air grew heavy, toxic. Oxygen levels plummeted, while the oceans warmed and turned to acid. In the water, entire ecosystems collapsed. On land, the situation was no less dire. The giants of the Paleozoic, creatures that had dominated for millions of years, began to disappear. This was not a swift end, but a slow, grinding apocalypse that stretched across thousands of years. In its wake, up to 90% of all species on Earth were gone. A great silence fell across the globe. Yet, to erase life entirely is no simple task. In the warm, shallow seas, in rare oases clinging to rivers and swamps, and even in the vastness of the expanding deserts, life held on. Those that endured became the architects of a new world, a world built on a foundation of ash. The continents had fused into a single, immense landmass, Pangaea. It was surrounded by the global ocean of Panthalassa, with the warm, shallow Tethys Sea to its east. But the sheer scale of this supercontinent created a world of extremes. Thousands of kilometers of harsh, arid land separated the interior from the moderating influence of the oceans. Mountains, plains, and desolate wastes stretched further than any eye could see. It was a cruel planet, and it was this planet that would give rise to the dinosaurs. But first, they were merely prey in a world dominated by other, enormous reptiles. Survivors forged in the crucible of extinction. All that we are, all that we build, is destined to become another stratum. A thin, silent layer in the deep memory of the world, waiting for a future intelligence to unearth our traces and wonder at the story we left behind. It is the great cycle. For the Earth, it is just one more chapter in its long and violent history. The interior of the supercontinent Pangaea was a furnace, a world forged in fire and silence. In the dawn of the Triassic period, the planet was a place of profound hostility. Temperatures across the vast, unified landmass remained punishingly high, baking the unstable soils under a relentless, unfiltered sun. Rain, when it came, was a rare and violent affair. Long, desperate droughts would give way to brief, cataclysmic downpours, unleashing flash floods that scoured the barren landscapes, offering no lasting relief. The very air was an antagonist. Oxygen levels were anemic, hovering at a mere 10 to 15%, a thin and challenging atmosphere for complex life. In its place, a choking blanket of carbon dioxide enveloped the globe, at concentrations 5 to 10 times greater than our own. For the majority of life forms that had survived the planet's greatest extinction, these were not conditions for thriving, but for mere, desperate endurance. Recovery was a slow, arduous process. The familiar comfort of a forest canopy was a memory from a lost world. Here, no great woodlands stood against the horizon. The landscape was raw, open, and exposed. Vegetation clung to existence in hardy, pioneering forms: resilient ferns, primitive horsetails, and rugged club mosses. The first conifers began their evolutionary journey, developing the adaptations needed to withstand the heat and the thirst. Yet they formed no dense forests, instead appearing as isolated islands of green in a sea of ochre and gray, tracing the hidden paths of rivers and the damp margins of lowlands. Most of the earth remained empty, a realm of rock and dust where the soil had no deep roots to hold it, a desolate world where only the most tenacious could carve out a life. But even on a planet teetering on the edge of oblivion, life endures. In this scorched and hostile world, sanctuaries persisted. These were the planet's arteries, the river valleys and their floodplains, the perimeters of swamps and ancient lakes. Along the continental coastlines and in the shallow, sunlit seas, the crucible of the Triassic was less severe. In these scattered oases, moisture was retained. Here, the temperature swings were less extreme than in the boundless heartland of Pangaea. The warm, nutrient-rich shallows of the Tethys Ocean were particularly vital, serving as cradles where simple ecosystems could begin the long process of rebuilding. These refuges were few, fragmented, and precious, islands of possibility in an ocean of heart. And in these murky havens, ancient dynasties held on. In the swamps, rivers, and lakes, colossal amphibians, the temnospondyls, had weathered the storm. Creatures resembling gigantic primeval salamanders, they were relics of a bygone era who found a throne in this new, brutal age. Bound to the water, they spent their lives submerged in its cool embrace or lurking near its edge. They required no complex ecosystems, no vast herds of prey. They were masters of patience, capable of waiting for months, concealed in the silt and shadows for a meal to present itself. In the freshwater realms of the early Triassic, they were the undisputed apex predator. The largest of their kind was the formidable Mastodonsaurus. This was a creature of immense scale, reaching lengths of 5 to 6 meters and weighing, by scientific estimates, well over a ton. Its most terrifying feature was its enormous, flat, triangular head, a solid wedge of bone more than a meter in length. Its gape was cavernous, a living trap lined with rows of sharp, conical teeth. Its primary diet consisted of the large, primitive fish that shared its aquatic world. But Mastodonsaurus was an opportunist. Any creature that strayed too close to the water's edge, a small reptile, a young synapsid, or a lesser amphibian, risked being dragged to a sudden, violent end. Kept moist and coated in mucus was a vital barrier against the desiccating air, allowing it to breathe and retain precious fluid. Etched into the bones of its skull and running the length of its body was a sophisticated lateral line system, a network of sensors that allowed it to feel the faintest vibrations in the water, detecting the stealthy approach of prey even in the darkest, muddiest pools. Their very future was born in the water, in soft, gelatinous eggs that could never survive on the harsh, dry land. Their world was small, confined to the water's edge, a testament not to dominance, but to persistence. They were a bridge between two worlds, the one that had perished and the one struggling to be born. In the shadow of the Great Dying, in a world scoured clean by catastrophe, complex ecosystems could not exist. The intricate webs of life had been torn asunder. It was an age for simple, brutally resilient predators, creatures that could cling to the peak of shattered freshwater food webs. Here, in the rivers and lakes that served as life's final redoubts, ancient lineages held on. Ray-finned and lungfish persisted, survivors of a global apocalypse. They possessed a resilience forged in ephemeral pools and seasonal streams, an innate ability to withstand wild swings in temperature and dissolved oxygen that had annihilated their more delicate marine counterparts. For these fish, the inland waters were not a limitation, but forsake the dying oceans for the relative safety of brackish estuaries and, at times, purely freshwater rivers. In the bleak landscapes of the early Triassic, with much of the supercontinent a hostile desert, these wetlands were the last bastions of vitality. The food chains were stark and short. This brutal simplicity, however, was their strength. It was this very lack of complexity that prevented life from being extinguished entirely. On the scorched earth beyond the water's edge, a new dynasty was quietly assertus. Eggs, the reptiles held a decisive advantage. Their scaly armor was a barrier against the desiccating air. Their revolutionary amniotic egg, a self-contained world for their young, severed the final link to the swamps and rivers, allowing them to reproduce in a world where amphibians could not survive. During this early phase, the reptiles were not giants. They were a diverse but sparse collection of small to medium-sized animals, ranging from mere tens of centimeters to perhaps 1.5 or 2 meters. They patrolled the dry plains, the fringes of the vital waterways, and the sparse patches of hardy vegetation that clung to existence. But as the early Triassic waned, a new terror emerged from this reptilian stock. They were the erythrosuchids, the red crocodiles, and they were among the first truly colossal predators to walk the land. The largest of them reached lengths of 5, even 6 meters. Their skulls alone could measure more than a meter, a bone-crushing testament to their power. For decades, they were imagined as semi-aquatic lurkers, sluggish beasts bound to the water. But modern science tells a different story. Isotopic analysis of their bones, a chemical echo of their lives, combined with studies of their microstructure, reveals a creature with an astonishingly high metabolism and rapid growth rates. This was no sluggish swamp dweller. This was an active pursuer, capable of sustained activity far from the water's edge, a true tyrant of the arid Triassic plains. They dominated until the middle of the period, a reign of terror that eventually faded, giving way to the more successful art. Yet the apex predator was not the era's most common signature. That distinction belonged to the synapsids, the sprawling group from which, one day, mammals would arise. And among them, one creature stands alone in the fossil record, Lystrosaurus. A stout, barrel-chested herbivore, a dicynodont reaching 2 to 2.5 meters in length, it was perfectly equipped to consume the tough, sparse vegetation of the recovering world. In the aftermath of the extinction, Lystrosaurus became, by an immense margin, the most numerous large terrestrial animal on the planet. Its fossils are not found in one location, but across the globe, from the strata of Africa and Asia to the frozen rocks of Antarctica, a testament to its unparalleled success. The reign of the erythrosuchids was a brutal but ultimately transient chapter. The true victor of the early Triassic was not the fearsome hunter, but the dogged survivor. In a world scoured clean, life does not always advance through strength and fury. Sometimes, the path forward is paved by simple persistence, by the ability to endure where others fall, a quiet testament to the unyielding resilience of the will to live. They were the undisputed inheritors of a broken world. In the wake of the planet's greatest mass extinction, a single form of life came to represent the overwhelming majority of all terrestrial vertebrates. This was the age of Lystrosaurus. Its survival was not a testament to speed, nor a victory of strength. It possessed neither. Its triumph was rooted in a far more potent advantage for a ruined era: resilience. Persisting within ecosystems stripped to their barest essentials. It weathered the punishing droughts and the chronic scarcity of food that defined the early Triassic period. In a world scoured by catastrophe, where the complex rules of the old order had been burned away, it was these humble qualities of persistence that proved to be decisive. Lystrosaurus did not conquer the Earth. It simply endured it. Its sheer numbers a testament to a planet on life support. Yet, moving through the shadows of this global monoculture were other, more furtive survivors. Parallel to the reign of Lystrosaurus, the cynodonts clung to existence. They were the smaller, more agile relatives of the dominant herbivores, but their path was rarely exceeding 1 meter in length, with many being significantly smaller. They were creatures of detail and specialization. Within their jaws, a more complex system of teeth was evolving: incisors for nipping, canines for tearing, and molars for grinding. Powerful musculature allowed for a stronger, more efficient bite. They lived a life of high metabolism and constant motion. Numerically, the cynodonts were insignificant. They were rare, inconspicuous players on a desolate stage, often hiding in burrows to escape the harsh climate and the gaze of larger mosaic of insects, grubs, and whatever carrion they could find. They were the understudies of the Triassic recovery, holding within their warm-blooded bodies a blueprint for a future yet unimagined. For it is from forms such as these that all mammals would eventually descend. But in these punishing conditions, evolution was not a march of progress. It was a desperate scramble for survival. Time, the ultimate agent of healing, passed in geological silence. The climate, once a chaotic engine of extremes, began to soften, yet true recovery was agonizingly slow. Only after 10 to 15 million years had passed since the Great Dying did the planet accumulate the stability required for life to truly begin again. By the Middle Triassic, the world was visibly transformed. The violent oscillations in temperature became less frequent. Rainfall, once a fleeting promise, grew more reliable, especially in coastal regions and along the vast meandering river systems. The greening of the land accelerated. Ferns and horsetails still carpeted the damp lowlands, but now, coniferous forests began to form more robust, permanent communities. For the first time in millions of years, there were landscapes where the foliage held fast year-round. With this returning abundance, complexity re-emerged. Ecosystems, once fragile and prone to collapse at the slightest climatic disturbance, grew more intricate. The food chains, brutally short in the aftermath, began to lengthen and intertwine. The supercontinent of Pangaea remained a vast, singular stage, but its internal seas were expanding, its coastlines becoming more convoluted. This shifting geography altered the very circulation of the atmosphere, distributing moisture more widely and nurturing a more resilient biosphere. Within this crucible of renewal, forces were gathering that would soon reshape the face of the land, the sea, and the sky. A new power was stirring on the recovering continent. A group of animals appeared that would fundamentally alter the structure of terrestrial life. They were the archosaurs, the ruling reptile. Michael designed. Their limbs were positioned more directly beneath the body, approaching a vertical stance. This was not a minor adjustment, it was a biomechanical breakthrough. It made their movement more stable, more efficient, and far less costly in terms of energy. In the hot and often arid climate of the mid-Triassic, this was the architecture of endurance. It allowed them to remain active for longer periods, to cover vast distances, and to colonize the open, sun-baked spaces that were inaccessible to their sprawling gated contemporaries. By this time, the archosaurs were not a single entity, but a diverse radiation of separate lineages, each beginning to seize key positions in the terrestrial ecosystems. Among them were fearsome predators, their gait no longer a waddle, but a purposeful stride. They were the dawn of a dynasty that would come to dominate the planet for over 150 million years. The story of this transition is not merely one of succession. It is a profound illustration of life's intricate dance with catastrophe. The meek do not always inherit the earth, but those who can endure its darkest hours are granted the opportunity to shape its future. The survival of the unspecialized Lystrosaurus provided a living canvas, while the furtive innovations of the cynodonts held a different kind of promise. And into this slowly healing world stepped the archosaurs, their bodies engineered for a new age of expansion and dominance. The end of one world is never truly the end, but the violent, fertile ground from which the next is born. The world was remaking itself. In the aftermath of a global cataclysm, life fought its way back from the brink, and on the vast, arid continent of Pangaea, a new dynasty of reptiles was seizing control. By the Middle Triassic period, the archosaurs, the ruling lizards, had already begun to diversify with explosive speed. Their forms were a study in evolutionary possibility, a spectrum of designs ranging from small, nimble hunters to colossal terrestrial predators, some stretching several meters from snout to tail. This burgeoning group was cleaving into at least two great branches, two distinct paths for the future of reptilian dominance. One of these branches would come to utterly command the land. At the vanguard of this terrestrial conquest were the Pseudosuchians, a fearsome lineage also known as the Crurotarsans. They were the undisputed tyrants of the Middle Triassic, occupying the highest rungs of the food chain. A rogues gallery of apex predators emerged from their landscape. These were not live, agile killers. They were walking fortresses, often reaching lengths of 4 to 6 meters. They moved on foe-fying, bone-crushing power. Their skin was frequently studded with bony plates, an armored testament to the violent world they inhabited. These titans actively patrolled the open spaces, the sun-baked plains, the sparse woodlands, and the fertile floodplains of ancient rivers. It was their presence, their relentless predatory pressure, that shaped the lives of every other creature on the continent. Yet, not all archosaurs were giants. Alongside these behemoths lived smaller, more agile-capable of darting through the undergrowth, occupying the ecological niches left vacant by their larger cousins. They were evidence of a complex and highly competitive archosaur community, a structured hierarchy where some lineages evolved for brute force and sheer size, while others staked their survival on speed and opportunism. It was this group, in all its varied forms, that began to define the very character of the terrestrial world, displacing the older dynasties and writing a brutal new set of rules for life on land. Among the old guard were the Lystrosaurus. These peculiar, tusked herbivores, survivors of the Great Extinction, were still among the most common animals on Earth. Their resilience was legendary, their ability to thrive in poor and unstable conditions unparalleled. They congregated in herds across the open plains and river valleys where vegetation clung to life. For a time, they had known a world with few significant threats. But the structure of their world was changing. With the rise of the great pseudosuchians, the Lystrosaurus faced a new and terrifying kind of pressure. For the first time, they were being systematically hunted by predators that far surpassed them in size, speed, and stamina. The pseudosuchians were active, relentless hunters who commanded vast territories, and the slow-moving herds of Lystrosaurs became their primary source of prey. This new dynamic heralded the end of an era. Across the Triassic landscape, the diversity of the once dominant large synapsids, the distant relatives of mammals, began a slow, inexorable decline. Meanwhile, in the waterways, another ancient lineage was facing its own crisis. The great temnospondyl amphibians still haunted the rivers, lakes, and swamps, but their dominion was becoming ever more fragile. Their absolute dependence on water, once a source of strength, was now a fatal vulnerability. As the climate fluctuated, the drying of lakes and the shifting of riverbanks posed a constant existential risk. And now, a new threat emerged from the land. Semi-aquatic archosauromorphs, less shackled to the water's edge, began to appear at the freshwater margins, competing for resources and territory in the amphibians' last refuge. The Middle Triassic was a crucible. It was a time of transition, where the survivors of an old world were being systematically outmaneuvered and overpowered by a new order. It was a world being written in the language of tooth and claw, a brutal new testament for life on land, where survival was a privilege, not a right, and the future belonged only to the victor. In the murky arteries of the recovering world, the rivers and swamps of the Middle Triassic, a new dynasty of predator held sway to the slightest disturbance in the water. They were joined by an array of semi-aquatic pseudosuchians, formidable archosaurs that patrolled the floodplains and shallows. These animals were masters of two realms, combining the lethal mobility of a terrestrial hunter with the patience and power of an aquatic predator. They were claiming the ecological thrones left vacant by the giants of a different age. This was a world wrested from the grip of the great amphibians. For millions of years, they had been the apex carnivores of freshwater ecosystems. Now, in the aftermath of global catastrophe, their dominance was irrevocably broken. The age of reptiles had begun, and the waterways were their first great conquest. But beneath the notice of these titans, life scurried on a different scale. In the humid undergrowth, small, furtive lepidosauromorphs, the distant ancestors of today's lizards and tuatara, navigated a world of insects. They lived a life of concealment, a critical strategy in an era of giants. Etched into the skulls of some was a biological marvel, a parietal organ, a so-called third eye. It was not an eye for seeing images, but for sensing the world in gradients of light and shadow, an ancient compass for discerning the rhythm of the days and seasons. Nearby, in the damp margins of ponds and streams, minor players in the grand drama of the ecosystem, but they represented lineages of survivors, humble lines destined to outlast the giants and inherit a future world. Yet the true architects of this freshwater renaissance were the fish. They were among the first to begin the slow, arduous process of rebuilding the world's shattered ecosystems. Ray-finned fish, descendants of lineages that had weathered the planet's greatest cataclysm, the Permian extinction, now proliferated. They were modest in size, yet immense in their resilience. Their tolerance for fluctuating temperatures and oxygen levels gave them a crucial advantage in a volatile world. Rivers and lakes, offering a measure of stability, became their sanctuary and their dominion. From bottom-dwelling foragers to swift, open-water hunters, they diversified, filling every available niche. This aquatic bounty became the foundational food source, sustaining not only the reptilian hunters in the water, but also the terrestrial animals drawn to the life-giving banks. As the global climate found a new equilibrium, this resurgence of life spilled from the continents back into the great global ocean. At its heart lay the Tethys, a vast, warm, and shallow sea, rich with the nutrients of a healing world. It was here, in these sun-drenched waters, that the first truly stable marine ecosystems of the Mesozoic era began to form. Ray-finned fish, having conquered the rivers, now exploded in the seas, evolving new forms adapted for high-speed pursuit, for life amongst nascent reefs, and for the crushing pressures of the deep. And where prey waters. Among the first were the nothosaurs, sleek carnivores, stretching up to 3 or 4 meters. Propelled by powers, still tethered to the shore for rest and reproduction. But they were not the most peculiar of the new marine pioneers. In the coastal lagoons, a creature of almost impossible design hunted. The Tanystropheus, itself a rare survivor of the Permian extinction. Its defining feature was a neck of extraordinary length, fantastically exceeding that of its own body. At a total length of 5 meters, its neck alone could account for 3.5. It was a living, breathing fishing rod, allowing its owner to lurk in murky water or on the shore, striking with lightning speed at unsuspecting fish passing near the surface. This was an age of biological experimentation, a time when the rules of life were being rewritten. And stranger formed specialized diet. The Triassic was not merely a recovery, it was a radical reinvention. Life, having been brought to the very brink of annihilation, did not simply regrow, it exploded in a riot of new forms, new strategies, and new possibilities. In the silence left by the fallen, evolution's creativity is at its most profound, scripting the next great chapter of existence from the ghosts of the old. In the shallow, sunlit waters of the Tethys Ocean, a new kind of fortress moved with deliberate gravity. These were the placodont's, reptiles that had committed to a life of unyielding defense. They were comparatively massive animals for their time, typically measuring between 1 and 2 meters in length, with broad, flattened bodies built upon a foundation of exceptionally heavy bone. Their evolutionary strategy was etched into their very skeletons. Many possessed thickened ribs and a mosaic of bony plates embedded directly within their skin, forming a near impenetrable coat of mail. This natural armor rendered them slow, ponderous creatures, but it was a small price to pay for security in a world of emerging predators. Their skulls were short, powerful instruments of force, house-bottom feeders that grazed upon the shelled bounty of the seafloor, mollusks, brachiopods, and other stubborn, sessile organisms. They spent the majority of their lives lumbering across the seabed, relying on the immense power of their jaws rather than the swiftness to chase. Their existence was a testament to the power of specialization, a life defined by armor and brute force. But as the Middle Triassic dawned, the seas witnessed the ascent of an entirely different design for life. A lineage of reptiles whose ancestors had been driven from the oceans by the Permian extinction now returned with a vengeance. These were the ichthyosaurs. Where other marine reptiles maintained a link to the terrestrial world, The ichthyosaurs severed it completely. They became masters of the aquatic realm. Their bodies, sculpted by the pressures of a life in water, grew sorrowful vertical tail fin, a biological engine of immense propulsive force. They were arrows of flesh and bone, swift and active swimmers that sliced through the water with breathtaking speed and maneuverability. They hunted fish and cephalopods, their strategy predicated on velocity and agility, the very antithesis of the placodont's. The arrival of the ichthyosaurs signaled a profound shift in the marine ecosystem. For the first time, the Triassic oceans had a truly specialized open water predator, a hunter untethered from the land, capable of pursuing its prey across the vast blue expanse. By this midpoint of the Triassic, the world was no longer the devastated empty space it had become after the Great Catastrophe. The ecosystems, on land and in the sea, had not only recovered, but had grown intricate and complex. On the continents, new dynasties of life were taking hold. In the oceans, stable food chains were forming, with armored grazers at the bottom and sleek predators at the top. The Middle Triassic had become an epoch of grand evolutionary experiments, a time when life tested countless forms, strategies, and pathways to survival. The world seemed to be approaching a new equilibrium. On the surface, nothing indicated the cataclysmic changes that were brewing. The oceans and the single supercontinent, Pangaea, appeared stable, locked in a timeless dance. But the most profound changes were not happening here. They were beginning deep beneath the surface, in the planet's molten heart. The slow, inexorable movement of the mantle's hot currents never ceases. This colossal engine was now pulling on the foundations of the world. Pangaea was too vast. Deep below, the crust began to gma, seeking release, surged upwards, fueling a dramatic increase in volcanic activity across the globe. These were not sudden, violent events, but a slow, inexorable grinding of geological time, unfolding over millions of years. Yet their consequences would inevitably breach the surface. Gases, vented from the planet's interior, poured into the atmosphere, altering the very composition of the air. The delicate climatic balance began to fray. The turmoil in the depths of the earth was slowly, but surely, being mirrored in the oceans, on the land, and in the sky. And on the surface, in the warm, stable climate, life flourished, utterly oblivious to the fire building beneath its feet, a fire that would one day reforge the world. The world was in flux. A deep planetary instability had taken hold. Across the vast singular continent of Pangaea, climates began to swing violently between extremes. Epochs of deluge gave way to centuries of parched earth, a relentless cycle of flood and famine that made existence profoundly unpredictable. Extreme weather was no longer an anomaly. It was the new, brutal rhythm of the planet. Beneath the surface, the very foundations of the earth were groaning under immense strain. The crust, stretched thin by mantle forces, began to fracture. Great faults scarred the landscape, giving birth to immense rift valleys that would one day become new oceans. In places, the land itself surrendered, sinking below sea level to form vast, shallow inland seas and sprawling gulfs, forever altering the face of the supercontinent. This tectonic agony was accompanied by fire. Volcanic activity intensified, not as isolated events, but as relentless, overlapping episodes of eruption that could persist for thousands of years. Entire regions became hellscapes, spewing colossal volumes of gas and ash into the sky. This planetary outgassing choked the atmosphere, shifting its chemical balance and triggering chaotic feedback loops in the global climate. The world was still one, a single landmass, but its structural integrity was failing from deep within its core. The planet was entering a violent phase of reconstruction. The late Triassic had become a time of immense and growing tension, an age where the old world still held its familiar shape, but was poised on the brink of a cataclysmic fracture. And yet, against this backdrop of planetary upheaval, life did not merely endure, it erupted. In the crucible of instability, some of the most audacious and successful forms ever to exist were forged. Deep within the vast Panthalassic Ocean, a kingdom of giants was rising. Among the ichthyosaurs, the great marine reptiles, a lineage emerged that pushed the boundaries of biological possibility. One such creature was Shastasaurus. By modern estimates, its colossal body could reach a length of 23 meters, a scale comparable to the largest whales of our own time. Its mass could exceed 30 tons. This was a leviathan of the Triassic seas, a creature of immense power, with a long, streamlined body propelled by a formidable tail fin, built for sustained, effortless cruising through the water column. But its annado, its teeth were severely reduced, or in some cases, entirely absent. This was not a creature built for a high-speed chase, or for tearing prey apart. It was a species, its cavernous mouth, and using powerful throat muscles to create a vacuum, inhaling its meals whole. This method of suction feeding was incredibly efficient, allowing it to sustain its gigantic size without the immense energy expenditure of a pursuit predator. The emergence of such titans was no evolutionary fluke. It was made possible by the sheer abundance of life in the late Triassic oceans. The marine ecosystems, though subject to the planet's broader instability, were rich and resilient enough to support animals of a size previously thought impossible. Shastasaurus was not an anomaly. It was the logical culmination of millions of years of ichthyosaur evolution within a thriving, nutrient-rich marine world. While these giants patrolled the depths, a revolution was beginning in the space above. As complex ecosystems formed in the water, a new process was about to conquer the air. In the late Triassic, an event occurred that would forever alter the skies of Earth. For the first time in the history of the world, a vertebrate animal broke the bonds of gravity and achieved true, powered flight. These were the pterosaurs. The first of their kind were comparatively small, delicate creatures. Their wingspan typically did not exceed 1.5 meters. Their entire anatomy was a masterpiece of lightweight engineering. The bones were hollow, thin-walled tubes, providing strength without mass, a blueprint that would be echoed by birds over 100 million years later. On long fourth fingers, membranes of skin stretched to form wings, catching the Triassic air and lifting these pioneers into a realm no vertebrate had ever claimed before. The late Triassic, therefore, was not an ending, but a crucible. It was an age of profound contradiction, where the world itself was breaking, yet life responded not with retreat, but with magnificent innovation. It is a testament to the relentless ingenuity of evolution, which, when faced with a world tearing itself apart, learns not only to survive, but to find new oceans to master and new skies to conquer. To keep the body light, nature had devised a radical solution. A single, impossibly elongated fourth finger on the forelimb served as the mathery membrane of skin was stretched taut. This was not the feathered architecture of a bird, but the elegant, engineered sail of a living kite. This was the wing of a pterosaur, and its design was a key to unlocking the sky, allowing not for mere gliding, but for powered, active flight. Among the earliest to test this new frontier was a creature known as Eudimorphodon. It was a small pioneer, its jaws lined with teeth of varying shapes, a specialized toolkit for snatching fish from the water's surface, for picking insects from the air, and for dispatching any other small prey that crossed its path. In these early days, the pterosaurs were not yet numerous. They were fleeting shadows, rare experiments in a world dominated by terrestrial giants. But they had claimed a realm entirely their own. The air, once a sterile void between land and sea, was now a theater of life. It offered a supreme advantage, an untouchable perspective. From above, one could survey vast territories, escape earthbound predators, and migrate across landscapes with an efficiency previously unimaginable. With the ascent of the pterosaurs, the Triassic ecosystem became truly three-dimensional. By the close of the period, these aerial sovereigns were no longer isolated curiosities. They had become a constant and vital presence in coastal and marine ecosystems. They soared over lagoons and shallow seas, their sharp eyes scanning the waters below for the gleam of scales. Flight was now their primary mode of hunting, of travel, of being. Their anatomy had become ever more refined for this purpose: a skeleton of hollow, lightweight bones, a deep keel for anchoring powerful chest muscles. While the pterosaurs were mastering the air, a different dynasty was reaching the zenith of its power on the ground below. The late Triassic was the age of the crurotarsans, the dominant archosaurs whose ranks had swelled to fill every conceivable niche. Earlier, more primitive lines had already vanished, giving way to forms more specialized, more successful, and far more terrifying. Among them walked the largest predators of their time. In the world that would one day belong to North America and beyond, great hunters held sway. None was more formidable than Saurosuchus. Reaching lengths of 6 to 7 meters, it was a massive, powerfully built animal, a quadrupedal engine of destruction. Its enormous skull housed jaws capable of crushing bone, and it stood at the absolute pinnacle of the terrestrial food chain, hunting the largest vertebrates of its day. A close relative, Prestosuchus, was a predator of similar scale, perhaps 5 to 6 meters long, but built for speed, an active hunter of open spaces capable of running down its prey. These were the true kings of the Triassic, the rulers of a world where the first dinosaurs were still just small, marginal creatures living in their shadow. But this kingdom of tooth and claw was also garrisoned by walking fortresses. Alongside the great hunters lived the armored crurotarsans. Etosaurus and its kin were covered from snout to tail in a dense mosaic of bony plates, an almost impenetrable shield against attack. At 2 to 3 meters long, they moved slowly through the undergrowth, their defenses ensuring their survival. They were the herbivores, the browsers, the unassailable tanks in an ecosystem defined by predation. This was the world in its final Triassic moments, a complex tapestry of life, with masters of the sky and titans on the land. It was a world of evolutionary experimentation, a dynamic and violent equilibrium. The conquest of one dimension did not negate the dominance of another. Instead, it created a richer, more intricate web of existence, a fleeting empire whose eventual collapse would pave the way for the next great age. The Triassic world was a crucible of evolution, a landscape dominated by the archosaurs. Among them, the crurotarsans reigned supreme. They were the true living fortresses of the ancient supercontinent, lumbering behemoths clad in armor, fueled by the coarse vegetation of a world still recovering from a mass extinction. They were the heavy infantry of life's great army. But this dynasty was not monolithic. Alongside these armored giants, evolution was conducting a riot of experiments. Lighter, more agile forms darted through the undergrowth. Some archosaurs rose up on long, powerful legs, becoming swift runners that blurred the lines between dedicated predator and opportunistic omnivore. This was an age of biological invention, a time when the diversity of body plans and survival strategies reached a fever pitch. In this grand theater of life, many crurotarsans bore an uncanny resemblance to the dinosaurs that would one day inherit the Earth. But this was a profound deception, a case of convergent evolution where similar pressures forged superficially similar shapes from entirely different lineages. Then, in the late Triassic, amidst this clamor of reptilian giants, a new kind of animal appeared. At first, they drew no attention. They were the dinosaurs. In a world governed by the sheer power and impregnable defenses of the crurotarsans, these newcomers were modest, almost peripheral figures. They were not the largest, nor the most fearsome. They did not occupy the apex of any food chain. But they possessed a secret, a set of evolutionary innovations that amounted to a superior design for the future. Their entire construction was engineered for endurance. The most fundamental revolution was in their posture. The dinosaurs adopted a fully erect stance. Their legs were not splayed out to the sides in a reptilian sprawl, but positioned directly beneath the body, moving with the metronomic efficiency of pistons. This architectural shift was transformative. It granted them a stability and economy of motion their contemporaries could not match. Every step, every stride, consumed less energy. In the harsh, arid climates of the Triassic, where oxygen levels were lower than today, this efficiency was a critical advantage. They could remain active for longer, cover greater distances, and outlast their rivals in the grueling marathon of survival. Their bodies, lighter and more compact than the massive archosaurs, were built upon a skeleton that masterfully balanced strength with relative lightness, a framework for speed and resilience. Yet another more hidden advantage was taking shape within their very chests. The dinosaurs were developing a respiratory system of unparalleled sophistication, one that featured a series of air sacs connected to the lungs. This was not merely a better way to breathe, it was a biological supercharger. It allowed for a constant one-way flow of fresh air through the lungs, maximizing oxygen extraction with every breath. But its genius did not end there. These air sacs extended into the bones themselves, hollowing them out, a process known as pneumatization. This lightened the skeleton without compromising its structural integrity. It was a dual-purpose system, a hyper-efficient engine for life that also reduced the cost of movement. It allowed the dinosaurs to maintain a higher metabolism, a faster tempo of life, and to recover from exertion with astonishing speed. During these early days, most dinosaurs were small creatures. A typical length was merely 1 to 2 meters, with many being smaller still. They were not challenging the great Crurotarsans for dominance. Instead, they were exploiting the niches left vacant by the slow and the heavy. They were the swift, agile opportunists, thriving in the margins. Among them, the fundamental split between carnivore and herbivore was already established, but neither group yet defined the character of the terrestrial ecosystem. And on the skin of some, another innovation was appearing. Not scales, but something new. Strange filamentous structures, the earliest precursors to feathers. At this stage, they had nothing to do with flight. That was a distant dream. Their purpose was far more immediate. A downy mantle for insulation against the chill of the Triassic nights, a way to maintain a stable internal body temperature. They were another piece in the puzzle of endurance. The reign of the dinosaurs did not begin with a violent conquest. It was not a sudden coup. It was a quiet, inexorable rise built upon a foundation of superior engineering. While the old guard relied on armor and size, the dinosaurs invested in efficiency, stamina, and adaptability. Their triumph was a testament to a simple, brutal truth of evolution, that the future does not always belong to the strongest, but to the most resilient, to the design best prepared for the long, unforgiving pressures of time itself. In the shifting world of the late Triassic, survival was a matter of adaptation. A new kind of integument, perhaps the earliest whisper of a feather, may have served not only in visual communication, but as a vital cloak against the planet's volatile temperament. These primitive coats help to conserve precious body heat, sustaining activity through the sharp, unpredictable swings of a global climate in flux. Yet, for all their nascent advantages, the dinosaurs were not yet the masters of this world. They were a secondary power, living in the shadows of their contemporaries. The continents were the dominion of an older, heavily armored dynasty, the Crurotarsans. These sprawling leviathans, relatives of modern crocodiles, were the undisputed rulers of the terrestrial realm. It was their formidable forms, armed with thick hides and powerful jaws, that occupied the key ecological niches. They were the apex predators and the colossal herbivores, the established order against which all newcomers were measured. The first dinosaurs existed alongside them, a collection of outliers and opportunists, cautiously avoiding direct competition while slowly, almost imperceptibly, expanding their presence from the margins. They did not emerge as a single, clearly defined class, springing fully formed into existence. Instead, the late Triassic saw them as a diverse and experimental group of small and medium-sized archosaurs. They possessed the key anatomical traits that would later define their lineage, yet they were still profoundly different from one another, each a unique evolutionary probe into the possibilities of a new age. Very early in their history, a fundamental schism occurred, a division based on diet and way of life that would dictate the grand narrative of their reign for 150 million years. The carnivorous and the herbivorous paths diverged, setting in motion two distinct destinies. It is believed the ear agility. Eoraptor, the dawn raider, stands as one of the most primitive examples we have unearthed, a nimble creature measuring scarcely 1 meter, testament to how closely these pioneers still resembled their archosaur ancestors. Slightly later, more imposing carnivorous forms began to appear. Herrerasaurus, one of the largest predatory dinosaurs of the Triassic, reached lengths of up to 6 meters. This was an active, two-legged hunter equipped with Power Ember of the dinosaur dynasty. Today, its position is more ambiguous. It is often viewed as either a very early representative of the group or a close cousin on a collateral branch, standing at the very threshold of dinosaur evolution. Crucially, however, even these formidable hunters were not yet dominant. They were consistently outmatched in sheer mass and brute force by the great Crurotarsans. But in parallel with the evolution of these predators, the first herbivorous dinosaurs were taking their first tentative steps. These were the early sauropodomorphs, the ancestors of the true giants that would later define the Jurassic and Cretaceous landscapes. Among the most renowned of this early lineage was Plateosaurus. This was a creature of considerable size, one of the largest dinosaurs of the Triassic. Its body stretched from 6 to 10 meters, and it carried a weight of several tons, making it the most massive dinosaur known from its time. Plateosaurus possessed a blueprint for future gigantism, an elongated neck for reaching higher foliage, a powerful pelvis, and a heavy, muscular tail for balance. Its forelimbs, shorter than its hind legs, retained flexible digits, allowing it to grasp and manipulate vegetation. Its very anatomy suggests a versatile animal, capable of moving on 4 legs or rising onto 2. By rearing up on its powerful hind limbs, using its tail as a third point of support, it could browse the crowns of tree ferns and other tall plants, a behavior that would be perfected by its colossal descendants. Despite its impressive size, Plateosaurus was still just the prototype. The world it inhabited was not yet its own. These early experiments in predation and herbivory were merely the opening movements in a vast evolutionary symphony. They were a dynasty in waiting, an empire of bone and sinew whose time had not yet come, but whose future was already being written into the fabric of the earth itself. From a single, ancient archosaur lineage, a great divergence had begun. One path led to creatures of prey, another to the plant eaters. This fundamental split in strategy occurred in the deep past, long before the shadow of the dinosaur would fall across the entire world. In these early days, they were but one thread in a complex tapestry, a diverse and experimental group, varying in size, in habit, and in the ecological roles they were just beginning to explore. Their bodies were often transitional, hinting at the giants to come, with the columnar limbs that would one day support titans, yet still retaining the blueprint of their more modest ancestors. By the close of the Triassic, the planet had found its breath again. A fragile equilibrium, the first true stability since the great dying of the Permian, had settled across the supercontinent of Pangaea. On land, intricate ecosystems thrived. It was not a world ruled by dinosaurs, but by their cousins, the Crurotarsans, a formidable dynasty of large archosaurs who occupied the apex positions. Armored herbivores and fearsome predators, they were the undisputed masters of this world. Alongside them, the dinosaurs lived, not yet dominant, but widespread and rapidly diversifying in the margins. Above, the pterosaurs had claimed the coastlines, their leathery wings casting the first vertebrate shadows from the sky. And in the vast global ocean, stable food chains supported leviathans. Ichthyosaurs, masters of the deep, had achieved colossal sizes in a sea teeming with life at every level. The late Triassic was a world of profound complexity, of deceptive resilience. But this stability was a mirage, a delicate balance poised upon a knife's edge. And that edge was beginning to rust. Then, some 200 million years ago, the equilibrium was not merely disturbed, it was annihilated. The planet entered a period of deep and violent change, as processes that had simmered for millennia erupted into a furious, active phase. A series of cataclysmic volcanic eruptions commenced, a geological event of almost unimaginable scale known as the Central Atlantic Magmatic Province. It was one of the largest outpourings of lava in Earth's history, a wound in the planet's crust stretching for thousands of kilometers. Today, its scars are frozen in time, identical fields of basaltic rock found in West Africa and the Eastern Americas, a final, stony testament to a moment before the Atlantic Ocean was born, when a single giant fissure wept fire. For hundreds of thousands of years, the eruptions pulsed in relentless waves. Unfathomable volumes of carbon dioxide, sulfur, and other volcanic gases choked the atmosphere. The climate, once a predictable system, became a chaotic engine of destruction. Temperatures swung violently. Rainfall patterns became erratic, turning lush plains to desert and deserts to floodplains. The very chemistry of the air and oceans was being rewritten. The ecosystems, built for stability, could not withstand the sheer velocity of this change. The first to fall were the large and the specialized. On land, the reigning dynasty of Cruro-Tarzans was almost entirely erased. The great predators and the heavily armored herbivores, whose success was tied to the predictable world they knew, found their adaptations transformed into anchors, dragging them into oblivion. The diversity of giant amphibians, creatures bound to fresh water and humid climates, collapsed. In the oceans, entire groups of marine reptiles and invertebrates vanished, unable to endure the lethal combination of thermal shock and rising water acidity. It was not an indiscriminate slaughter, but a filter of brutal efficiency. This was a great winnowing. Survival was not granted to the strongest or the largest, but to the most adaptable, the least specialized. It was a world reset, a slate wiped clean by fire and gas. And in the story of our planet, catastrophe is not just an ending, it is a crucible from which new dynasties are forged. In the crucible of a world remade by fire and gas, the dinosaurs proved uniquely prepared. Their advantages were decisive, etched into their very biology. An economical gait that conserved precious energy, and a revolutionary respiratory system that fueled a higher metabolism. Unbound by narrow climatic zones, they were masters of dispersal, rapidly colonizing the niches left vacant by their fallen rivals. In the skies, the pterosaurs endured, their wings granting them the ultimate freedom to escape local devastation. And in the oceans, the great marine reptiles fully committed to an aquatic existence, those untethered from the fragile coastal ecosystems, weathered the storm. The great crisis at the close of the Triassic did not extinguish life. It merely reshaped its architecture. The world once dominated by the great archosaurs of the Triassic was gone forever. Dinosaurs survived not because they were the strongest, but because they were the most adaptable. Thus, one age closed and another began. The Jurassic, an era that would see the dinosaurs rise from survivors to undisputed rulers of the Earth.